suppose we could call today's talk Karmic Studies. And I'll try to give my own rendition of the meaning of karma. And what comes to mind first of all is, to me, that the idea of karma is really the human condition. So that every human being is born into the human condition. And when we die, we come out of the human condition. I can't talk about past lives in the sense of reincarnation, but what I would say about this particular life obviously might reflect back in terms of making a life review. That is, you study your karma in terms of your life story, and if you lived before, then you had a life story then. So there may be a continuity in the story, but in looking at the one story, as it were, then you can get an idea of what might have been lived before. So we're born into the human condition, and as soon as we're born, that conditioning process begins. So you could say that the child is exposed to conditions on the earth, as it were, and in nature and in culture, human society. And we can assume that the consciousness of an individual child is formed of those conditions. And of course, when they learn to speak and express themselves, then that becomes the way they're identified in society. So you take on a particular identity you could call the ego as the center of consciousness, and when you're in communication with other people, you're sharing the impressions, the experience and the knowledge that you have, and throughout your life that's what you'll be doing. And in lots of different ways people come to understand their life. They think about their life, they try to work out what's best to do, they get things right, they get things wrong. And you could say everybody's working through their karma, because the human condition is karma, and therefore we're working through that karma in our consciousness. So you could say the human condition is fundamentally cultural. Culture is the knowledge in your memory, and the memory informs your consciousness. So it's one process, in a sense it's one process of consciousness. So inwardly and outwardly, the human condition, the karmic condition, is really human consciousness. and we appear to be living individual lives with individual consciousnesses, and yet we're living in a kind of collective situation in terms of the world around us, the society, the history, the particular country, but more or less we're on a planet. We're on a planet, and in today's world, there's ideas of globalization. So through the internet, they talk about the global village, as if we're all living in this global village. And more our lives are overlapping, so there aren't many isolated communities. So you could say that through the internet most communities are aware of each other, and more you might say what goes on in consciousness individually is being shared collectively, and knowledge is being dispersed, cultures are overlapping, and there is a kind of sense of the human species, you might say, on this planet, on the verge of maybe spilling over into other planets, other solar systems. So it's a very interesting time historically as well. So we get a feeling that we're all moving forward, and history on the planet, the history of the human species, is kind of crystallizing in some way. And then you could say, well, how does karma work? Well, obviously, in one sense, we inherit the past from our parents. So we may inherit genetic characteristics and psychic characteristics. Like in my own family, there's quite a lot of music in my family tree. There's art in my family tree, literature, and that's been passed on to me and my brother and sister. So those kind of traits are passed on, I think. And of course each person is very individual. The conditioning varies in individuals. People are exposed to different things. And for example, when I grew up, my family really didn't take me anywhere. My brother and sisters were much older, so they weren't that interested in my life. But I used to go around Oxford and the colleges and the museums, and was very impressed with all of that. I spent a lot of time in my childhood in those places and in nature a lot. I didn't read books, we didn't have television, I didn't listen to the radio. So anything on the radio, like music, was just in the background. So I didn't collect anything, I didn't belong to anything. And really my whole childhood was like a blank sheet of paper. I took in all these impressions on a much, you might say, more intuitive level and a feeling level. And I'd say it was more of a qualitative life. And much later on in my life, I did become very involved in what was in a museum, especially in Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum and the Pitts River Museum. They included artifacts from Aboriginal times and all other times, China, Greece, Egypt, medieval, India, everywhere. So I was exposed to all those impressions, and I spent a lot of time looking. But I didn't read books and I didn't know what really I was looking at. I didn't really understand it or anything like that. So you might say, as a child, what you might call karmic studies, i.e. you're aware of the world presented to you as a karmic experience, as it were, a kind of karmic challenge. You know, what are you going to do about your world? What are you going to do about your karma? How are you going to work out what's going on? What's the meaning of your life? What the choices you make and the things you've got to deal with, inwardly and outwardly. So I would have had no sense of that whatsoever. And when I moved from Oxford to America, and I went through high school and went through university, I still had no idea of a concept of karma, in the sense that I saw life around me as a challenge. I saw life around me as something to be responsible for and to take a special interest in the way I behaved, in the way things corresponded to my life. And I think it was when I had an awakening at 23 and I had a shift of consciousness and I became enlightened, as it were. And I mean by enlightened, I became self-aware, and I no longer was perceiving things from the vantage point of a kind of ego consciousness. Now that kind of shift, I think, made it very clear to me that there is a difference between living a kind of egocentric life or an ego-centered life and just making choices within your consciousness, whether you like this or like that, you want to stay in university or not, you want to go with this girl, you want to marry this girl, or do you want to go to another country, you want to read this book or that book. And I think most people just go from A to B to C, and unless something traumatic happens, unless a shock comes in, that most people just live their life and hope that it will be all right. And not necessarily see life as a challenge, but just get through whatever way they can. So you might say they're working through their karma, their human condition, without necessarily becoming aware of that, making it conscious and realizing that there is such a thing as karma. So as an individual, the idea of karma has to have an individual expression. Although we're all in the human condition, we're highly individualized, we have a highly developed character and different capacities and different ways that we will deal with the world. So when I had this shift of consciousness, so that I no longer filtered things through my consciousness, no longer was I choosing in the ordinary sense of whether to do this or that, but I was more self-aware, then I began to become aware of other things operating in the world that had a special significance for me. Not as a choice, like I was in university, I didn't get along in university, I dropped out, didn't get along in the marriage, came from England to America, I started doing art, I started doing poetry, etc. And then suddenly I'm much more self-aware, and the world around me presented me with a completely different landscape than before, literally. So people I met weren't the kind of people I met in the past. The books I read weren't the same kind of books. And my sense of myself in the world was radically different from a specific identity within my consciousness that said, oh, I'm a student and maybe I won't be a student, I'm married and maybe I won't be married. And that kind of movement in identity, which is the movement of consciousness itself, lost its momentum. And so when there was a shift to self-awareness, in distinction from ego awareness or ego consciousness, then I had to rethink. It's almost as if my consciousness had to adapt to a completely different world. I mean, if you look at Jungian psychology, you have the idea of the ego as the center of the conscious mind, which is what most people function from in society. The ego conscious mind, as I say, makes choices based on whether you like something or not, whether it agrees with you or not, whether it's good for you or not. And you're an artist, you're a politician, you're a mother, father, and you do your best, and you are what you are, and you accept that, and you get on with your life and live your life. And then you've got the subconscious, where certain activity in the subconscious may feed into the conscious mind and present much more, you might say, complicated activity that might make you doubt what you're doing, make things uncertain, may bring about new motivations, feelings that might be contradictory to the way you feel in your conscious life. So the ordinary life that is on the surface and is being lived out in the world with other people, the interior life may be quite different, so that you're, as I say, more uncertain, you're in contradiction, and things are much more complicated in your emotions and your inner life, as it were. And then you've got what Jung would call the deeper levels of the psyche, and where you might say dreams are, visions, much more subtle perceptions, and symbols and mythology. And most people in their conscious life in the West especially would ignore that level, and the scientific outlook would be that that kind of level is irrelevant to your life. So anything religious, spiritual, magical is seen as a sort of aberration or simply imagination or fantasy, and even delusion, or even classified as a kind of mental abnormality or a mental deficiency or a mental illness, even like schizophrenia, etc. So when I was 23, I had this shift of consciousness, and I was reading a particular book by Hermann Hesse called Narcissus and Goldmund, and he happened to be a friend of Jung. But when I read the book, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know who Jung was. So I didn't know anything about these people in spirituality and psychology and that kind of thing. I didn't know about these figures. But I read this book. And I was a friend of someone that was an artist, and they'd been travelling in the East and had come back to America. And living a quiet life, you know, kind of retreating from the world, you know, had been out in the world, now he's retreating and living a quiet life in the country. And this book mirrored our lives. There were two central characters, Narcissus and Goldmund, and there was a monk and an artist. And he was an artist that was out in the world, then came back and became very monkish. And I was a person going out in the world, going back to England, going around Europe, in the same way one of the characters was wandering around Europe as a sculptor, and I was doing sculpture, and when I saw the comparison and I saw the synchronicity of he as the monk Narcissus, who was more or less living in his own world, and me about to go out into the world like an adventure, and Goldmund, as if Goldmund is like in search of the gold, alchemical gold or something, which I didn't know anything about alchemy at that time. And you know, I was very struck by that. I was very struck. That's my first recorded synchronicity that I was conscious of in my life. And I mean, I didn't give it a lot of thought, but it did strike a chord. I mean, it really did like wake me up. So how that would function in the Jungian model, how that would function is that you've got the conscious mind that we would call consciousness. Then you've got deeper levels of the psyche like dreams and visions and that kind of thing. And then you've got a deeper level called the collective unconscious that contains the archetypes. Now the archetypes are they're organs of perception, you might say, but you can't access them directly. You know, it's like, say, the interior of your body, like your stomach and your heart. They're functioning in your body, but you can't have access to them. You can't control them. They're just working in the background and working, you know, keep your body functioning and that kind of thing. While the archetypes keep the psyche functioning, you might say. So the archetypes are organs of perception, and they project into your body and your consciousness, or into the psyche and your body, and into the outside world as well, as synchronicity. So the synchronicity I had by reading a book and then realizing that that reflected my actual life, that would be created by the archetype. And so the archetype can project a kind of signal, what you call a psi signal, a parapsychological psi signal that connects a physical event with a psychic event. So you have a dream of something, and then that dream comes true the next day. So you could say, I'm reading the book as a kind of psychic thing. I'm reading the book with my mind and psychically, and then I realise that it has a physical correspondence in my life and the other person's life. That's called a meaningful coincidence. Now, I think from that level of the archetype, that is what reveals to you what you're meant to understand in your karmic studies. So when we're talking about karmic studies as a thing you actually study, when you become aware of karma working in your life, you're becoming aware of what I would call synchronicity. And synchronicity is a revelation, it's what's being revealed to you about your nature as a whole. So it's not just the conscious mind making decisions and dealing with like psychological difficulties or emotional difficulties or even subconscious uncertainties and all the contradictions and confusions that's related to the conscious life you're living in the world. And you may not even really become responsible for anything in particular. You may not know that there's deeper levels of karma. There's deeper levels that have to do with, you might say, a transformation within your consciousness as a whole, within your body, your psyche, and your consciousness as a whole. So the archetype works on the whole of your organism. It works on the whole process of your life. In other words, you're living the human condition, and the archetype affects the whole of the human condition because it's objective, it's not in the human condition, it's outside of the human condition. So the dream and the psyche and visions, that's still part of the human condition. And what goes on around you, you live in a house, but the world around you, the buildings, institutions on the planet, they all affect you. So consciousness is aware in the physical world of the world around it, and consciousness in the interior world is aware of the psyche, the dreams and the deeper levels of the psyche around it. So consciousness is kind of like interfacing the inner and outer, and is a kind of, with the ego at its center, so it's kind of like a circle with a point at the center. Then you have these expanding and contracting concentric circles around the ego consciousness. So you have a dream, and that becomes like a concentric circle that's expanding, and then you wake up and you remember the dream, and then it contracts back into consciousness. You take that information back into your consciousness. Just like you go out in the world, you go into a library and bring the book home, so you can read it in private, in your own consciousness, as it were. And that's often likened to a spider in the web. So the flies and the insects get caught in the web, and they get devoured by the spider. So it's a very self-consuming kind of process, self-devouring in a way, process consciousness. It's absorbing, it's mainly concerned with itself, it's mainly concerned with its interest in the world. You know, and it could be focused in the nuclear family, so people only think about their family, or if they're very ambitious, they only think about themselves going up the social ladder, or one country thinks about itself and doesn't care about other countries. So that's how it would work. So you might say on one level it's not really learning, it's not really adapting and learning in an open way. Whereas if you shift from ego consciousness to self-awareness, then you're much more open to the human condition as a whole. You're not limited by the limited knowledge and conditioning in your consciousness, but you're open to the whole world in a way, the whole human condition. And therefore, archetypally and synchronistically, things will arise or come into your purview or your world view, as it were, in ways that are much more creative, much more uncertain, much more unpredictable. They will be shocks and revelations that really are out of your control. They're not within the control of the ego consciousness. They're not in control of the country. They're not in control of the nuclear family or the institution or the belief system or the power structure of this and that. So because the archetypes are operating from outside of the field of, you might say, the literal physical world and the literal psychic world, then there's a better chance, you might say, of having revealed to you things about the human condition that speak to you on a deeper level. And I'm saying that deeper level is really where the real karmic process is operating. If you're in a relationship with someone and you say, you think you get along and you marry them, you think you love them, etc., etc., and then things start cropping up, like you didn't realize what they were really like. You didn't, their emotions, their character, their behavior, their personality, their opinions, their moods, deeper level moods that they've got, prejudice they've got, all these kind of things come up, and they're revealing the deeper level of the karma, deeper level of the problem, of the human condition within that person that they may have inherited, that may be inherited from their family, ancestors, but also, as I say, in reincarnation, they brought something over, some unfinished business, something they've got to work through in this life, something very specific. So when you get to the idea of specification, what is it the individual has to deal with specifically, may be presented to you in the place you live. You may go from one country to another, and that presents you with a more specific rendition of your karma. But of course you may not see it in those terms, but nonetheless that challenge to your character, that challenge to adapt to a situation or a relationship or a you might say a career choice, and you're weighing up deeper level problems. And so in the relationship you realize that you want things to go in the right way, but you or the other person can't change. It's like you're blocked. There's a kind of obstacle that's interfering with the established pattern or conditioning of the conscious mind, the two conscious egos. The two conscious egos choose to live together. The two identities, the two people, from a conscious perspective, and say, oh, I like her, and so forth and so on. We've got a similar lifestyle, and we live in this particular place, and she's an artist, and I'm a politician, or whatever the situation is. And that's quite straightforward. That's what people do. They so-called fall in love and they get along and everything's all right. Then you realise this woman isn't the person I married. There's something else going on. And you want to change that. And often people go to therapy and stuff, individually or together. But anyway, you know, you want to resolve this difficulty, so you do go to therapy, and you go to Freudian psychoanalysis, or you go to counselling, or you go to Jungian therapy, etc. And you're trying to kind of resolve this blockage, this obstacle in the relationship. But at the same time, you could say that's the challenge being presented to you by the archetypes. That's the challenge being presented to you by your karma. I mean, just like in the world of politics, I mean, how, you know, America gets along with Russia or China, that's part of the kind of more global karma. That's the kind of karma of the species or whatever. But you know, any obstacle that prevents relationship from going forward, that is a kind of conflict or a disharmony, you know, like in nature. I mean, if nature faces a problem, it gets around it, adapts to it, it absorbs it, it transcends it, it works it out in the sense of evolution of the species. So species that can't survive the adaptation to, like, climate or to the adaptation of a predatory species, then you know, it gets thrown out of the situation. So we have to adapt to each other, we have to adapt to our life, but more importantly, adapt to our karma. So I think for most people, if you ask them at the end of their life, how was their life? What was the meaning of their life? What did they distill from their life? What was the essence, the soul essence of their life? And some people might say, you know, it worked out pretty good, you know, and I don't have too much problem with it. Another person might say they got blocked as a teenager, they got blocked in a marriage, they got blocked in a career choice, or they get blocked by they got a genetic illness or something, you know. And people, you know, I think if people were very, very honest, I think most people would say there was an obstacle. Maybe it wasn't expressed outside in their relationship with the people they live with, but maybe in themselves, you know, there's an incompletion, there's a deficiency, or there's something that made them feel life could have been more complete, more fulfilled, more perfect. And then you get the idea, if they don't resolve the karma in this life, they have to deal with it in another life, whatever. So you have I think you have two principles operating. You have fate, which is necessity and karma, and you have destiny, which is, you might say, the more positive outcome. So if you're an artist, that's like a gift. So you know, you say, I've got a healthy body, my mind is quite clear, I'm an artist, and you know, you're painting pictures, etc. So you want to live out your destiny, but there are problems in your family, you've got problems with money, you've got problems with the society you're living in, you've got problems that you've inherited, etc., etc. So fate stands in the way, fate is interfering with your destiny. So you could say, you know, the human species in terms of history and evolution has a kind of destiny, you know, and so some people think it's a religious destiny, other people think it's a scientific destiny, etc. At the age of about 19, I was doing poetry and art. And I went to university, did philosophy and comparative religion. And so I was just living in my ego consciousness and making choices and enjoying life, and, you know, life was on my side, as it were. And then I had this shift of consciousness and what I call the dark night of the soul. So it's like a kind of fate took over. It's like fate, you know, in the sense of representing the darkness, as it were, the shadow world. It became like a shadow world. But the whole perspective of my destiny changed at the same time. So it's a shock to my system. I have this shift of consciousness. I'm much more aware of myself as distinct from my ego consciousness. So I'm kind of living in a completely different way, probably more archetypally, more synchronistically. And so in a short while I get over that dark night of the soul and become very peaceful and very enlightened, in a way self-aware, enlightened to myself, and felt very liberated. So you could say there was fate, like a shock. It kind of like knocked me over, as it were. I thought I was going through an illness or something like that. And then there was a recovery. So I was kind of go from the dark to the light, from you know, my destiny as an artist and university, that kind of collapsed, as it were, that identification in my consciousness. So in a sense, you fall from grace, as it were, from the light into the dark. And then I came out of that darkness into the light, but it's a completely different world. So it's just like the shift I made from Oxford to America. It's a completely different world, you know, a kind of culture shock. So anyway, I adapted quite well to this new kind of lifestyle, as it were, and I was reading spiritual books and seeing my new life, my new destiny as a kind of spiritual journey that eventually led me to go to the Himalayas. And when I was in the Himalayas, I came upon another dark night of the soul. So I had this first shock that took away my destiny. I go out to India and I get another shock that took away my destiny. So that when I went out to India, I thought, oh, I'd meet this Lama, this Tibetan Lama. I'd learn from him, and I'd meet other people, and they would help me in my spiritual journey. But when I got there and I was meeting the Lama, I just didn't feel things were right. And so I left and started wandering around. And then this shock came that again just shocked me out of my destiny, as it were, and put me into a very dark place, what the Tibetans call the void. So my first experience of the void was like I thought there was a kind of illness or some shock in my system, or something was, you know, desperately wrong. And almost like a breakdown when I left my marriage and university. It's almost like a kind of breakdown. And now this second, you know, the breakdown led to a breakthrough from the dark to the light. Now this second one was much deeper, and I was unprepared for it. So you could say, in a sense, the void, if you would like to call it the void. So within the psyche, within the interior world, as it were, there's a thing called the void. So that's a word, that's just a term. You can call that a symbol of the dark night of the soul, of fate, of the shadow, of even death itself, psychological death. So in the Tibetan system, when you die to your ego, you die into the void. So the void is a kind of negation. It's like when you enter the void, the ego consciousness is dissolving, as it were, and it's a kind of negation of the ego in favour of the self. Well, I was already self-aware, so when I had this void experience, I was self-aware, so I knew that I was interested in it, although it was very shocking and fatalistic, almost fatalistic, because it was very, almost like a psychological death, as it were. So it's very fatalistic. So it's not just fate, but actually fatalistic. And it's interesting that when I left England to come to the Himalayas, I went across land, and I hitched some rides, I went on the train, I went on a boat, and I was in this one car that was coming through Iran, and I was in a car crash, and I could have easily died. I mean, I was in concussion, I had glass all over my head. Anyway, I went to the hospital and everything was all right, and I just forgot about it. It was like I didn't even think about it. I didn't think, oh my God, I've been in this terrible car, maybe I shouldn't go to India, or maybe, but I never had any of those kind of questions or anything like that. I just carried on, I just forgot all about it. But it's interesting that maybe that was a prefiguration or a warning or a caution that something quite dangerous is going to happen to me. It could have been that. I didn't actually look at it that way. But again, that's the way karma would work. That's the way fate would work. That's, it's like if you get an illness, say you're working and you think everything's working in your direction, then suddenly you get an illness. And you think that's bad luck. It's bad luck. But again, that's fate and karma coming in and saying, look, you're too, either too selfish or too self-important, you're full of yourself, and you're not attending to certain issues in your life, you're ignoring certain issues in your life, maybe to do with your family situation, etc. You're being irresponsible, and we're going to knock you off the stage, as it were, and bring you down to earth. So anyway, that car crash could have been actually some kind of signature of what might happen. And I felt in that void experience I was going to lose my memory, my consciousness, my ego, my memory. So it was really like the psychological apparatus that keeps your consciousness in order and keeps you sane and keeps you balanced and keeps you focused in the world. That was going away. So as I wandered and went to the temples and did all these different things, I felt that I would literally lose my memory. And so that meant going into the void 100% in that kind of negation of the conscious mind. So you might say the flame or the light of the conscious mind was going out, just like the dark night of the soul led to the light. Now this darkness is like precipitated by what they call nirvana, the void, is referred to as snuffing out of the candle. So in a way, the candle is the flame of the ego consciousness, and you're going to snuff it out. Or you're going to be snuffed out, as they say. But I saw that as a challenge. I didn't kind of psychologically, emotionally, in my ego, in my consciousness, I didn't find that a problem, just like I didn't find the car crash a problem. So I wasn't looking at life in the sense of I like this or I don't like that, or this should happen or shouldn't happen. I was much more open to black and white situations. I was much more open to the kind of naked fact of fate and destiny, luck and bad luck and good luck. So it is on a much deeper level, a much more fundamental level. And I think that, again, that's what karma is. It's putting before you not superficial choices or choices that come easy to you, but much more primal forces that in a way force you into a position of life and death. So you could say the human condition is about life and death, and then you've got all these degrees of black and white and light and dark and shadow and light. You've got all these varying degrees, and the more conscious, the more under the control of the ego, the self-centeredness, the more superficial it becomes. So I like her, I like him, I like this, I like that. And living like that, watching television and believing everything you see, and living in a consumer society or whatever, that kind of superficial life. So I come back to England, my memory's all right, and I enter again this very illuminated state, very peaceful, very silent, and feeling very liberated again. So myself feels that things are working out, I'm on my destiny again, the open road ahead of me, as it were. So these so-called karmic lessons, as it were, you might say alter your consciousness. So they're not altering your consciousness from the inside in the conditioning sense. So, you're living within your human condition, within consciousness, the world prescribed by your ego, the world that you're in control of. You're in control of the choices you make. You're in control of, you work here, you work there, etc. You have this sense of control. Then something comes in and just, in a sense, interferes. There's a blockage and interference, and fate comes in and changes your prescribed destiny. The world you're in control of. That in fact, in terms of the human condition on this planet, nobody is in control. In the end, in the final analysis, no individual is in control of their life completely. And no politician and no institution, religious or scientific, is in control of the human species. We don't know whether science will be successful in the long run. Maybe it will cause our extinction, we don't know. Maybe our real destiny, and maybe it's just a karmic thing we're going through. So from the self position, which I see as the one, as freedom and unconditional, from that unconditioned perception, you're looking at your life, you're looking at your consciousness, you're looking at your choices, you're looking at the events that are happening to you non-judgmentally. You want to face the reality of your condition. You want to be yourself no matter what. So in a sense you could say, if consciousness is the human condition in microcosm within you, and it reflects the human condition in the macrocosm around you, because it's all made up as the same field of knowledge, the same field of experience. We all live more or less now in the global world, as it were, so that we're all sharing in similar experiences, similar knowledge, Most of the institutions are kind of connected. Science is a global process, religion is a global process, etc. So, from the self position, it doesn't matter the outcome of fate and destiny. And it's not about taking sides, black and white, like yin yang. It's about being true to the Tao. So now we're talking about, you might say, something in transcendence of fate and destiny, black and white, the kind of the conditions of consciousness, the human condition itself. So we're talking about something like the Tao, the Great One, or the One, or God, as something transcendent to a particular life story, a particular karma, or even a particular aspect of history. So if you've lived before and past lives, or you look right back in history to Aboriginal times, thousands of years ago, from the transcendent position, which I would refer to the self as the transcendent position, that position is not taking sides, is not playing one thing off against the other. So whether in the end, whether you're successful in your life or you fail in your life is not the issue. Whether you're healthy or ill is not the issue. So what is the issue, I think, is living the life that's presented to you as a whole. You're living the human condition as a whole, and we're all living the human condition on this planet as a whole, if we're open to adapting to a movement, you might say, that isn't prejudiced, that isn't selective, that isn't even evolutionary. It's not even about the survival of the fittest or, you know, animals adapting to their environment. It's not that kind of issue. It's not an evolutionary issue. It's not a scientific issue. It's not even a religious issue about saving the world or Christ and Buddha being the Redeemer or something like that. It's not about that. So it's about, I think, karma, the human condition, that the individual lives through that human condition, and we're all individuals living through the kind of human condition on this planet. And what it is what it is. But it isn't what it is if we're controlling you might say a deeper level movement that affects the whole world, affects all of your whole self, the whole world we live in. Therefore, karma, you might say, is about transforming the whole human being, the whole genetic physical structure, the whole, what I would call the symbolic code of the psyche, the whole fabric of the psychophysical, from an archetypal, which would be a spiritual point of view, and that would be the way of the Tao, the yin-yang working within the Tao. So if you take the yin-yang symbol within the circle, the circle being the Tao, the circle of eternity, the One, which is the South position, then that whole process of the human condition, which we call the human species, from its conception thousands of years ago, that whole condition is a kind of karmic journey. That whole condition is a kind of karmic journey. So they say that in Hinduism, that there are different ages and different cycles, and we're in the end of a cycle at the moment. We're coming to an end of a cycle at the moment. So in Revelations in the Bible, they say that we're living in an apocalyptic time, like the second coming of Christ. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they call that the incarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the incarnation of love. And of course, Jesus Christ represents love. So you could say, what's going to heal the wound, which is the fate of the human species? What's going to heal the wound? Well, what's going to heal the wound of a broken relationship between people, between countries, is love. The healing balm of your own soul, as it were, and the world's soul, as it were, it is love. So that's a kind of prediction from an objective, archetypal point of view. So Buddha is a symbol of the South, Christ is a symbol of the South. They're both symbols of the Tao, they're symbols of transcendence. They've gone beyond this earth, as it were. You might say their perspective is transcendental. So if you look at it in your own life, something's blocking you from transcending the human condition. Something's blocking the species from transcending the kind of innate confusion and conflict within the human consciousness based on egocentricity, self-interest. So karma is really recognizing what's blocking you. In my case, it was the void. For me personally, it was the void. I stayed with that. I rode the wave, as it were. I kind of faced the tsunami. I faced whatever. Like the animals have to face the ice age. So you face this kind of monumental challenge and go through it. Work through it, because karma is really basically work on yourself. And work on yourself is not just individual, but the whole species is working on itself. Globally, in society, it's working on itself. It's trying to get things right with the Tao, both personally and collectively, or the microcosm, macrocosm. And as the 17th century Rosicrucian Gerhard Dorn said, unless you make one of yourself, you can't make one of the world. Unless you are in order, then the world won't be in order. Unless you face your karma, the world's not going to face its karma. So you could say, in an apocalyptic sense of transition from this cycle to the next cycle, if you will, or even from this planet to another planet, who knows, that we've got to go through this negation, this void. We've got to deal with the obstacle, the shock to our system, the trauma, and in whatever way it presents itself to us. And it's the archetype, synchronistically, that will reveal that to us. Because the archetype is working from a transcendental level. And the archetype is, you might say, from the spiritual realm. So the one, the self in the one, the enlightened self, is, you might say, is in touch with the spiritual dimension, the transcendental dimension. And so the self is working holistically from that dimension, both in one's own life and in the world around you. And so, as I say, the healing balm is love, as predicted by Christianity and Hinduism or Buddhism. So, in oneself, you have to incarnate the spiritual value or quality of love. And what's preventing that between two people? What's preventing that between two countries? So there's an obstacle, there's a conflict, there's an inherent division. And that duality, that separation is the wound between oneself and the world, oneself and another. And the two sides of the wound, that duality, has to become a unity by healing the wound, sealing the wound again. And so love, in a sense, can't incarnate, in a world that's karmically ignorant of its karma, ignorant of what is that blockage. What is, people can project and say, oh, there's some evil, some devil, some evil, as Hitler was preventing the healing of the wound, or it was somebody else. And what is that obstacle? What is the, you might say, the antithesis of love? And of course you say hate. So yeah, you could say there is an intrinsic element of hate within people, somewhere, that's preventing them from loving each other. So in the yin-yang symbol, you have the positive with a little bit of negative inside, and you have the negative with a little bit of positive inside. So in a way, the compassion, which is another aspect of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the incarnation of love, one of the aspects of the spiritual aspects of the Maitreya is compassion. So in a sense, you could say, to have compassion for the other person, the other country, the other people, whatever they are, the enemy, whatever they are, to have compassion for the fact that, yes, they maybe we're each involved in some hateful, so-called evil position. There's some element of that in us which requires compassion. And then compassion is a kind of acceptance. When you're compassionate, you're non-judgmental, so you're kind of accepting people as they are, which is again karmic. You accept conditions as they are, and then once they're settled, the yin and yang are in balance, then the one, the Tao, the love principle, then can come in. So there's a factor that you've got to face karmically that really pivots on the idea of division, duality or conflict. I mean, that is to me what is at the root of karma. It's getting it right, getting a balance, weighing things up, dealing with the obstacle, which is like dealing with the enemy, dealing with the forces that in the world, in yourself, that are preventing communion, preventing dialogue, preventing harmony, preventing, the spiritual intention to work things out, work through the problem. So I don't think it should be limited to hate, to evil, to the devil, that kind of thing. I don't think it should be limited to that. Because in my own case, the void is not specific, but it's a factor in the psyche. It's not specific. So maybe the death of the ego consciousness, the death of the I, the selfish nature of the ego consciousness, and being negated by the void, a kind of psychological death to your old self, to your sense of self that wanted things your own way. We all want things our own way, for our family, for our country, for our religion, for our belief and politics. We all want our own way, but we can't have our own way because these other factors come in and prevent that. Like when Britain colonised the world, it wanted its own way. It wanted world domination. The Nazis wanted world domination. Napoleon wanted world domination. Genghis Khan and Julius Caesar. I mean, they all wanted world domination. And now science wants to dominate the world and genetically engineer everything and whatever with computers, supercomputers and all of that. And will they get their way or not? So there's all forms of negative forces, as it were. And what's the antidote? So you have the idea of negative forces within science, and then you have, people who are bringing the ethical idea into science. So there's the whole ethics of what science is doing. Is it good for us? Is it good for the species? And all of this is, you might say, the process of consciousness, being the human condition. It's all our shared consciousnesses. It's what is the world we're making out of our consciousness. So we've got to find a balance. We've got to work it out. And the self, if you discover yourself as distinct from the ego, then in a way you can stand back and not take sides and just let the process of consciousness allow it to unfold in its own way, allow things to unfold more creatively, more naturally. In other words, get out of the way. mean, in my daily life I've got to make decisions. I'm still involved in consciousness. I've got to work out my relationship with certain people, very difficult, very deep level problems with people, and they're affecting me, and I'm bringing my own distress or obstacle or blockage to the table. I'm sharing it with another person. We're working through very deep level blockages and deep level obstacles to the relationship. So in my own life, there's a problem with love. And that's in my consciousness. And I've got to work through that. And there's no easy answer. There's no answer in a book. And there's no answer in therapy. I mean, the two people face to face have to work it out whether they're going to remain divided in their ego and take sides, as it were, or are they going to be self-aware and treat it more holistically and have compassion. And rise above that, as it were. Rise above the human condition that's limited to ego-centeredness. So yeah, I mean, it's a daily challenge, and I'm not projecting a solution, I'm not projecting even an intention to solve the problem. I'm just living with it. I'm not idealistic, I'm more realistic, I'm just living it. I don't have an answer, I don't have a prescription. And just like in the Middle East, it's a living dilemma. I mean, karma in the real sense of the word, the human condition is a living dilemma. And it's a challenge. To me, it's not negative or positive, it's an incredible challenge to one's intelligence, to one's spiritual integrity.